Rosemary is perhaps one of the most instantly recognisable scents among the culinary herbs. It makes roast potatoes taste amazing, and I've always found its scent helpful when I need to concentrate. But there's also a lot of folklore associated with this plant. Rosemary was known as dew of the sea, elf-led, compassweed, guardrobe, rose of Mary and sea dew, among others. And its evergreen nature perhaps explains why rosemary was once used alongside holly as a Christmas decoration. People spread it on their floor at Christmas during the Middle Ages. This meant it released its scent whenever anyone walked on it. Nicholas Culpeper and William Lilly both attribute rosemary to the sun. The cult of Aphrodite apparently used rosemary, and it was also associated with the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages. And if that wasn't enough, Ophelia mentions rosemary in Hamlet, explaining that it represents remembrance. But what else does this fabulous plant have up its sleeve? Why was it used in Tudor weddings and Victorian funerals? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. As I record this, it is 29 degrees C in Newcastle upon Tyne, and let me tell you, it very rarely does that. So it is quite warm here, so it is rather ironic in some ways that I am doing the folklore of a plant that's attributed to the sun. But you know, I suffer for my art, what else can I say? Anyway, we are going to just jump straight into this episode, because obviously, as with all of these plant-based episodes, there's usually more to cover than I think there is. So we are continuing with the series of episodes that are based around that refrain in Scarborough Fair: parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme. So obviously this week it's rosemary, next week we'll do thyme, and then the final week in July we're going to be looking at things like basil and dill and marjoram and things like that, because there's not as much about them, so there's not enough for individual episodes, so I thought I'll just stick them all in the one episode. But anyway, on to rosemary. I don't know if you've ever actually seen rosemary in bloom or not. I don't think I ever have, but apparently it does have blue flowers. And according to folklore, these were apparently once white. During the flight into Egypt, Mary spread either Christ's clothes or her own cloak, depending on the version, over the rosemary bush to dry. After doing this, its flowers turned blue. In keeping with its Christian theme, the plant was said to bloom at midnight on Old Christmas Eve, which is otherwise known as Twelfth Night, and obviously there is a Twelfth Night episode if you are interested in that. And if you smell the scent of rosemary on Christmas Eve, you'll have good luck during the coming year. I do have to wonder if that's why so many people put it in with the Christmas potatoes, but there we go. It's probably hardly surprising that rosemary has this range of beliefs about its protective nature with these Christian overtones, and planting rosemary near the front door helped to keep evil out of the house. You could also grow your own rosemary, dry it and hang it by the doorpost to deter thieves, and planting rosemary on either side of the door would repel witches. If you feel that your home is being plagued by a bad atmosphere or a streak of bad luck, you can do a smoke cleanse using rosemary. And this is just basically binding lots of branches of rosemary together and then essentially setting them alight and then sort of putting it out again so that they're just smoking, and then you walk around the room with them and you make sure the smoke gets into every sort of like nook and cranny and so on. Obviously, if you do that, please actually look into smoke cleansers first to make sure that A, you're not going to accidentally set off a smoke detector, and B, that you do actually have adequate ventilation and nobody's allergic to the plant first. But rosemary could also be used to ward off fairies, poltergeists and spirits, and an Irish belief meant that hanging rosemary over a cradle could stop fairies from swapping a baby with a changeling. And if you've listened to the changeling episode, you'll know that some people used to hang a pair of open scissors over a cradle, so I can't help thinking rosemary was probably the better choice between the two. But despite this, rosemary was actually dedicated to fairies in Portugal, and it was used in Spain to ward off the evil eye. If you drank from a spoon made from rosemary wood, that would protect you from poisoning, and keeping a sprig of rosemary under your bed could keep bad dreams away. And alternatively, you could make a small sachet from blue fabric and fill it with rosemary, and if you pop that under your pillow, it should ward off nightmares. In terms of other strange things that you could do with rosemary, you could make a box from rosemary wood and then smell it every day to enjoy eternal youth. Or you could also restore the vitality of youth with a decoction of pounded rosemary leaves. And apparently such was the power of rosemary that you could actually cleanse other dried herbs of any negativity simply by storing them beside rosemary. Now obviously if we're talking about strange things to do with rosemary, we do obviously have to mention 4 Thieves Vinegar, and you'll also know this if you've listened to the previous episode on sage. Rosemary does sometimes appear in the recipe for 4 Thieves Vinegar, and this first appeared in Marseille, where 4 grave robbers were plundering graves during a plague outbreak, which is perhaps not the best choice of things to do. When they were caught, they claimed that they'd used a special potion to protect them against contracting the disease. Now there is an alternative version that sees the thieves invent the vinegar after they've been sentenced to bury plague corpses, but either way the intention is ultimately the same, to use the potion to stave off the plague. Now if you're interested, one version of the mixture did contain lavender, rosemary, distilled vinegar and cloves, and obviously other recipes do also add garlic, wormwood or sage accordingly. Now in terms of its folkloric uses, Christina Oakley Harrington notes that rosemary signified rulership, a little bit like we saw with sage last week, and this partially explains why it was used in wedding ceremonies, since the husband expected to rule over his wife. Now that said, there was also a belief that rosemary will only grow near a house ruled by a woman, which does complicate things. So Harrington suggests a remedy if you feel that you're in a role that requires authority, but you're not getting the respect that you need. And someone should give you a bunch of rosemary tied with red and purple ribbons, and this will confer the authority that you need. Rosemary apparently grows better in households run by women, and I quote, where the grey mare is the better horse, end quote. But that said, in Buckinghamshire, people actually believed that rosemary would thrive or die back depending on the fortunes of the master's business. So it's quite interesting to suddenly see it attached to business in that Buckinghamshire belief when it's normally associated with essentially who rules the roost, as it were. Now I did mention weddings before, and rosemary was said to ensure success in love. And there was a belief that rosemary would help the bridal couple to remember their marriage vows. In the Middle Ages, newlyweds would plant a rosemary branch, and if it didn't thrive, it was essentially a bad omen for the new family. Tudor brides, meanwhile, dipped rosemary into scented water and then wove it into their bridal wreaths. Now, apparently Anne of Cleves did so, and if you can't remember who Anne of Cleves is, she's Henry VIII's 4th wife. She's the second divorced in the divorce beheaded survived rhyme. And boys carrying a silver gilt cup filled with sprigs of rosemary escorted her to her wedding. Now, obviously, if you're aware of history, then you'll know that that didn't exactly guarantee her wedded bliss, because Henry VIII did divorce Anne just 6 months later, but considering his general treatment of his wives, I think she actually did quite well there. And not dipping any rosemary branches into water that were to be given to the bride apparently meant that she would die young. People did continue to carry rosemary in their bridal bouquets until the Victorian era, and bridesmaids would even give rosemary to the groom to enhance his married happiness, and I do have to wonder if that was also a little bit of a sneaky jibe to make him remember his vows as well. And people commonly use rosemary as a stuffing in poppets to attract a lover. And indeed, there was also a belief that you would actually fall in love if someone touched you on the finger with rosemary. And I can't help thinking you could possibly do double duty there by making a poppet filled with rosemary and put it under your pillow, and it would both attract a lover and repel nightmares. So, you know, multitasking is always quite useful in these things. Now, despite the link with weddings, rosemary did also make an appearance at funerals, and you've probably noticed this through this edible herbs theme that we've been having. Parsley and sage also have links with both love and death, and rosemary is no exception. And again, being evergreen, it represented immortality, and its links with both scent and memory meant it also represented remembrance as well. And if you cut a branch off a rosemary plant and stuck it into a grave, the original plant would then wither once that branch had rotted. So this was essentially almost killing a bush by association with a grave. I don't honestly know why anyone would do that, but that is what a belief in 1903 said. People would place rosemary into the corpse's hands, while mourners carried sprigs of rosemary until the early 20th century, and the mourners would then cast these sprigs into the grave. And the scent of rosemary, some people think, was apparently welcome at funerals to mask the scent of the corpse. And obviously rosemary is quite a strongly scented plant, so I can see why you would do that. You can always show your respect by wearing a rosemary sprig to a funeral or memorial service even now. And if you do have any kind of ancestor practice, you might add a sprig of rosemary to your altar for those ancestors that you actually remember. And there's also a third bit which I find quite interesting, that people also once stirred the christening cup with rosemary, which does make rosemary one of the few plants to appear at christenings, marriages and funerals. So I do quite like the fact it does rather do double duty there. And one of my favourite aspects of rosemary is its use in different forms of divination. And 2 of these are to do with romance and 1 of them is to do with prophetic dreams. So if you were single and you wanted to know which person you were going to end up with, you were recommended to head to a churchyard near midnight on Midsummer Eve. At the stroke of 12, you could run round the church scattering a mixture of rose leaves and rosemary, and then you would chant, "Rose leaves, rose leaves, rose leaves I strew, he that will love me come after me now." And then you should see a vision of your intended, although I can't help thinking that might give you a bit of a fright in a dark churchyard. The other thing that you could do is set a dish of flour under a rosemary bush on Midsummer's Eve, and then if you retrieved it the following day, you would find that your future partner's initials had been written in the flour. Now, there was a somewhat involved method to ensure prophetic dreams using rosemary that Christina Oakley Harrington relates, and in this one, you needed 3 women who were under 21 to gather on St Magdalene's Eve, which is July the 21st. The girls needed to go to an upstairs room in a house, which was usually a bedroom, and then once there, they should mix wine, gin, rum and vinegar in a jar made from ground glass. Each girl would then dip a sprig of rosemary into the mixture, which they would then pin to their dress, and then each girl would take 3 sips of the mixture, and then all 3 of them should sleep in the same bed and their dreams would be prophetic. So, as I say, there's quite a lot of moving parts in that one. That could be an interesting experiment for July 21st. But as well as romance, there's also a link with friendship as well. And there was a belief in London that you could actually plant a rosemary bush to attract friends. And you could help new friendships to grow by giving a new friend a sprig of rosemary. And also, if someone you know moves home, you can give them a potted rosemary when they move, and that will help them to attract friends in their new area. You can also use rosemary to help remember old friendships as well. And Sir Thomas More apparently allowed rosemary to grow all over his garden, and I quote, "because it is the herb sacred to remembrance and therefore to friendship," end quote. And in terms of remembrance, Ruth Binney actually relates speculation that rosemary's scent lingers and then smells evoke memories, and that's where the association between the two comes from. And that could explain why in ancient Greece, students put rosemary behind their ear or in their hair to aid concentration during exams. Because obviously, if there's any time that you want to actually remember things, it's obviously during an exam. And in its way, rosemary has become a really popular and somewhat flexible herb to keep in your collection. And to demonstrate in this closing section of the podcast exactly how flexible rosemary was, in the 1920s, it had also become added to 2 popular remedies for baldness. And one preparation included rosemary, paraffin oil, white wax, rum, beef marrow and castor oil, and you would rub that onto your hair for about 15 minutes. And the other remedy involved spirit of rosemary, oil of sesame, oil of lemon, ammonia and chloroform. I wouldn't really recommend either of those because obviously they're just the other ingredients that are in them aren't things that you necessarily want to rub onto your head, but that is indeed what people thought would work in the 1920s. But it does just go to show how whether you're trying to banish evil, boost your appearance, find love or remember the departed, you can essentially use the same herb for all of them. And if nothing else, it smells fabulous. So what I want to know is, what do you make of rosemary? Do you like rosemary? Do you use rosemary? I sometimes use it in my diffuser, particularly if I'm trying to clear a headache. I actually find it's one of my 3 scents that I use to banish headaches, along with lavender and peppermint, but that's just from lots of experimentation on my part because headaches are a fairly constant part of my life. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode on rosemary. As I say, we're going to do thyme next week. Remember, as always, all of the references for everything that I've talked about today can be found on the blog post that goes with this podcast episode, and you'll find the link for that in the show notes below. This week I've posted the exclusive article for patrons, and that was actually on the Cornhill Devils in London, which is obviously not plant related at all, but the bonus content sometimes isn't related to the main content on the podcast. And the bonus episode is actually on the folklore of ferns, because ferns are one of my absolute favourite plants. My garden's full of them at the moment, and I just thought that obviously it would be nice to stick to the plants theme, even though they're very, very definitely not edible. So if you're interested in ferns, then obviously check out the bonus episode. The illustrated talk that is available to support us at £5 a month or more is going to be on how flowers represent things in art, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, particularly through previous art related episodes, but this time I can actually show you works of art, and then we can look at what the different plants and trees and things in those paintings represented as like a form of symbolist language. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, hopefully you'll enjoy that illustrated talk, and obviously a replay is available if you can't make it. So that is what's available, as I say, at the £5 a month or more tier. Other than that, though, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. I hope that you manage to handle the heat, if indeed it is still hot on Saturday. I don't know. It might be. It's Monday the 11th at the moment, so it might be sleet and snow by then. Who knows? That's what British weather can be like. But I hope they have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week when we finish off our Scarborough Fair theme with Time. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.